And I had mentioned last time about Hebrew, the Hebrew language. And it's very interesting if you haven't studied it. It's very significant in its use in the Bible. It started as 29 different characters. And in the ancient Hebrew, they were like pictographs, like pictographic images you'd see in caves or something, kind of similar to that. But each pictograph had a different meaning. And right here, you don't have this in your notes, but what I'm showing is I have like a leaf is the first one, and it was like an ox head, and it meant like a leader. It was used to symbolize God. Bet, the next one, was actually a symbol that meant like a house. Gemel was like a foot. Hay meant like to behold or to see. Va actually looked like kind of like a stake, and it meant to like secure or fasten or nail. So each one of the characters in the Hebrew language, in the original Hebrew language, meant something, much more than just a character. It was a letter, it was also the number, but it had a meaning all of its own. And that becomes very significant when we look at the Old Testament. If you notice the first two there is Aleph, Bet. What does that sound like? Alphabet. That's where the term alphabet comes from. So anyway, this is what I'm going to go through a little bit here at the first, is what the Hebrew meant. And when you look at different letters, words in the Bible, a lot of times you can break it down and look at these individual letters and characters and what they meant and put them together and just get incredible meanings of what our Bible is all about. So first, let me start in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this wonderful evening. Thank you for all of those that would come to listen to this and to further their knowledge of your word. And Father, I just ask for your blessing and your presence in the presence of the Holy Spirit with us tonight as we go through this. And Father, I ask you to lead me in the things that I say, and that the things I share are understandable and logical and truths from your word, and nothing from me, but just let me be your hands and your feet and your voice in showing this. In Jesus' name, amen. Fred, do you have a Bible? Does anybody have a Bible? Someone turn to Genesis 1:1 and start reading. That didn't what it said. Yeah, start reading on Genesis 1:1. Stop. In the beginning. Isn't that wonderful? That is the entire message of salvation. In the beginning. The Hebrew word for that is Bershet. Bet, Rosh, Aleph, Shin, Yod, Tav. Bershet. It's the first word in the Bible. It translates to English to in the beginning. If I look at that, Bet, Rosh, Aleph. Bet is a house. Rosh is the head or the first person. The head or the first person of the house in Hebrew, that was the firstborn son. He had complete control of everything in that house. Remember the story of Joseph and the really fancy colored coat? His brothers weren't mad that he had a fancy coat of different colors, but that coat signified that he was the head of the house, that he was the first person of the house, that he had control of everything. So it means like the firstborn son. It means the one who will have control and direction of that household. We see that a lot with, Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and when they got the blessing, how Israel crossed his arms and said, no, that's wrong, the other one was firstborn. It's very significant who that firstborn child was. So the first two letters, Bet Rosh, are the head of the house, or the firstborn son. The next one is Aleph. Bet Rosh Aleph. Aleph is the strength or the leader. This is significant of God. The next one is Bet Rosh Aleph Shin. So the next one in Bershet is Shin. And Shin is this character right here, and it's teeth. And it means to eat, to consume, to devour, or to destroy. The next one is Yod. Yod is this figure right here, and it's significant of like an arm and a hand. Yod means like with my hand, with my strength, by my power, something like that. It's just a hand and an arm. If I had Yod and then a broom, it says, with my strength, I'm going to sweep the house. So Yod just means hand. And the next one is Tav. Bet Rosh Alif Shin Yod Tav. Tav is this character right here in the ancient Hebrew, and it was a mark or a sign or a covenant. It was also a cross. So this first word of the Bible, Bet Rosh Alif Shin Yod Tav, Bershet, which means in the beginning, is the Son of God will be destroyed by his own hand on a cross. What is the likelihood that that was just by chance? So the very first word in the Bible, Bershet, in the beginning, is the Son of God will be destroyed by his own hand on a cross. The next word in the Bible. In our Bible, it's in the beginning, God created, right? In Hebrew, the God created is turned around, it's created God. Kind of like how in English we say White House, but in Spanish we say Casablanca. So it's in the beginning, God, or in the beginning created God. This next word, created, is Bet Rosh Alif. It's the same three terms. So created in pictographic Hebrew means the Son of God. So it's showing that when it says in the beginning created God, that word created pictographically says Son of God. So that goes along with John, the Gospel of John, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that came into being. So that second word in the Bible, pictographically, in ancient Hebrew, means the Son of God, created. So we see there that it's linked. We see that the first word of the Bible, Genesis, is the entire story of salvation, right? The Son of God will be destroyed by his own hand on a cross. Only took one word. The Bible just takes one word to describe the whole message of salvation. It gets deeper. In the beginning created God. Okay, our next word, God, Elohim. Elohim is Aleph, Lamed, He, Yod, Mem. These characters, if I had glasses I could see. So Aleph is that first word again, which means the leader or God. Lamed is this character right here. And it means like a staff or a goad. It's a shepherd's staff, right? It's significant of a shepherd. The third one, He, is this character again. This character right here, He. And it means to see or behold or look after. So it's this character right here. The next one is Yod. Again, that was the arm or hand. And the last one is Mem. Mem is waters. So Mem means water. So if we look at Elohim pictographically, Elohim means the Lord is my shepherd. He looks after me. He takes me by the hand and leads me to water. Does that sound familiar? So the first three books in the Bible, in Genesis, in pictographic ancient Hebrew, if you look at it in depth, it's the Son of God will be destroyed by his own hand on a cross. The Creator was the Son of God. And God is the Lord my shepherd. He leads me, he takes me by the hand and leads me to water. Where do we see that? Psalms 23, right? That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So the Hebrew language is very important in an in-depth study of the Bible. And you can see this in a lot of places. When Moses, when he was tending sheep for his father-in-law, and he stood on the mountain, and he saw the burning bush, and he approached the burning bush to look at it, and it was God, right? And God had a long dialogue with him about going in and taking his people out of Egypt. Remember that Moses asked God, "What is your name?" He said, "Who should I say sent you?" What did God respond? I am, or I am that I am. The I am is Yod He Vah He. That's the Hebrew for I am. Yod is the hand, right? Yod He. He is behold. That is this character, to see or behold. Vah is a tent stake. It's a stake or nail, right? Like to secure, fasten, to nail something. So Yod He Vah, and then He again, behold. Yod He Vah He is behold the hand, behold the nail. So pictographically in Hebrew, the tetragrammation Yod He Vah He, where we get Yahweh and Jehovah by adding vowels to it, what that means pictographically is behold the hand, behold the nail. So I think this is all by chance, or was this God's divine inspiration? That's some pretty neat stuff. Okay, so with that, let me look at some of these. This first one here, in the beginning, I read that John 1:1. In Colossians 1:16, for by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. So we see here that Jesus was with God in the beginning. We see from the very name created, we see that that was the Son of God, that Jesus was the creator. He worked with God in creation of all things. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of give you that as an introduction to how powerful Hebrew is in the Hebrew language. Okay, Genesis, our first book here. In Hebrew, it's called the Torah, which just means law. And it's the first book of the law, this being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So these 5 books are the law. In Greek, it's called the Pentateuch, which you've probably heard that more often. Pentateuch means 5-fold vessel. So it's just referring to the 5 first books of the Bible. So Genesis, the book of Genesis, we have 50 chapters here in this book. And it's our ancient history for the first 11 chapters, kind of up until the time of Abraham. And then it starts the story of the family of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we see this from chapters 12 through chapter 50, just the stories of this family. Exodus was their deliverance out of bondage from Egypt. Remember that in Hebrew, typically the name of a book related to something that was going on in the book, typically the first book. Genesis meant beginning, like in the beginning. Exodus means exit, getting out. Leviticus, the third book of this, Leviticus has to do with law. It is the laws subscribed to the Levites, one of the tribes. So Leviticus is all about law that is given to the Levites, and we'll talk about them more, how they became the ones who were God's servants in the temple and in charge of the law. In Leviticus, we see how many laws? 613. So there's 613 laws in Leviticus and 10 commandments. So in order for us to have been pure in the sight of God, we would have had to have kept 613 laws and 10 commandments. How's everybody doing? I know of one that I've kept. Do not eat bats. I think that's the only one I've kept. Numbers, the 4th book of the Torah, it's called Numbers because there's a census taken at the beginning of it and at the end. This was how many people were at Mount Sinai, and then how many went into the Promised Land. And so it was called Numbers because they were numbered. It's kind of like a census. It's more about wanderings in the wilderness. Another good name for that book would have been The Wanderings, because Numbers talks about them, their 40 years in the wilderness. Then Deuteronomy, the last book. Deuteronomy is like a second giving of the law, but this was like Moses' last 3 sermons. In Deuteronomy, it's like breaks into like 3 sermons that Moses gave to the people just before they crossed over into the Promised Land. Interestingly, Deuteronomy is a legal contract. It is like the boilerplate for almost all legal contracts written today between like a landlord and a tenant. And what Deuteronomy spells out, it's God's legal document with his people of if you cross over and take the land, take the promised land, if you do this, 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 and this, then I will bless you with this. If you don't do this, then here's what the cost will be, what it'll cost you. So Deuteronomy is almost like a legal contract that God made with his chosen people before they crossed over into the promised land. So these are the first 5 books of the Bible, and we'll start with today with Genesis. Now, Genesis was written by Moses shortly after the Exodus in 1445 BC, so about 3,500 years ago. Now, what has happened? Moses went in to Egypt, did 10 plagues against Pharaoh, and brought his people out and brought them to Mount Sinai. God wanted to take this people to a promised land. Did they know anything about God? Had they been going to church on Sunday morning and reading their Bible and going to Old Testament survey on Friday night? They hadn't done anything. So these people did not have anything in writing, right? They really didn't know much about God. They would have heard stories about Abraham, about Isaac, about Jacob possibly. They had seen his miracles, the 10 miracles that got them out of Egypt, but they didn't know much about God. So what God is doing is taking them out of Egypt and taking them to a place, Mount Sinai, and for a year he teaches them. He gives them his laws and commandments, and he teaches them, because you have to know more about God before we can serve God, right? So he brought them out to teach them before he took them to the promised land. So this was the first writing by Moses, was this Genesis. Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, he had scribes with him, so he wasn't physically writing it all out himself. He had scribes that would work with him as he wrote. Most Bible scholars believe that he got Genesis in that 40 days on Mount Sinai, that this was given to him, and he had scribes with him that helped him write it. So this is where this comes from, that God would have given him this history, the 11 chapters of ancient history, and then everything in his life, up until that time of Mount Sinai. So that was given to him in 1445 BC. So Genesis contains historical, legislative, and spiritual background of the origin of the human race, as well as a record of the Hebrew race. The first 11 chapters are what's kind of our ancient history. So if we look at ancient history, that's the first 11 chapters of the Bible, and it covers the first 2,000 years. So this covers a time period from Adam and Eve all the way up to the time of Abraham's birth in his life. So the first 11 chapters cover that. The next 39 chapters cover the life of the family of Abraham. Everything we look for through in our Bible from chapter 12 of Genesis up until the birth of Christ in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of that is about one family lineage, the family of Abraham. We see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then all the descendants all the way up through Noah, through Shem's descendants. In the entire Old Testament is about this one family. Why is that? Why do we start out with the history of the entire world for 11 chapters and we just go to a history of one family? Descendants of one man, Abraham. Yeah, it all goes back to what happened in the Garden of Eden. Remember, after man fell, God said that her seed will crush your head. So it's all about a battle. It's all about a war between the seed of Eve against Satan, right? Now, when Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, a couple things happened. God had to They were aware of their nakedness, and God clothed them, right? I kind of hope it was in snakeskin. They had to leave the promised land, and another thing happened to them. They were, from then on, they were mortal. They had to die. God made the statement, says, "This day you will surely die." He didn't die that day, did he? He lived 936 years. But if we look in Psalms 90:11, I believe, and also in John maybe, it says to the Lord a day is 1,000 years. So in God's timeline, he died that day, less than 1,000 years. Methuselah, the oldest man, died before 1,000 years. So they were given that as a cutoff time. So in this, we have the first 2,000 years, is the first 11 chapters, and that takes us from Adam and Eve and ends with Abram, who became Abraham. And then chapter 12 to 50 cover the next 300 years of history and the Hebrew nation. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So Genesis ends with the people of Israel in Egypt and the death of Joseph. So this is the timeline of Genesis. It's 2,300 years. Adam and Eve up to Abraham, Abraham through his great-great-grandson Joseph being in Egypt, and his death at 110 years old. When I was about 22, I got interested in a timeline. Yeah, sure, would you? Or if you'll get some of them, thanks. And I was working in Phoenix, and this was before AutoCAD. This was actually a time of CAD-AM, which is a computer software to generate mechanical drawings. And so rather than working on what I was supposed to be working on, thanks so much, I did this. And what I was looking at, I was interested in this. I warned you not to fall asleep. Okay. Oh, I must have gotten too close to the speaker or something. It wasn't? So I can't do it again? Oh, good. I hope so. I'm watching for anyone to nod off. Okay. So what I did is I looked in Genesis chapter 5, and we have a lineage there. And this lineage says Adam lived 130 years, and he begat a son, Seth, and Seth lived so many years. And what was so neat about this is now we have a last name. It was Adam and Eve begat. Right? Maybe not. Okay. The Begat family. So I'd like to show you about the Begat family. This is a timeline of Genesis chapter 5. And what I did here, this is looking at the overall picture, just cut in half. What I did is Adam lived at 130 years old, he had Seth. So what this shows here is I basically did it in scale where 130 inches out, I put Seth in. Then also here, see this 930 next to Adam? That is how many years he lived. So if you come over here to 930, his line ends. So this is just a family tree, in effect, of the first 10 patriarchs. Now it continues up here on the lower part of page 1. It continues up here to the flood. And from Genesis chapter 8, we have that flood. And then the line continues in Genesis chapter 11 of Shem's descendants. And Shem's descendants come up here to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, Joseph, and the 12 tribes of Israel. Pages 2 through 6 are blow-ups of each individual page. So let me kind of look at this. If you go to page 2 of this handout, and you notice the author of this is God. What this does is this timeline starts at the year 0 and progressively gets larger as we go to the right. So it's looking at God's timeline. 0 being the day that Adam was born. That would have been roughly day 6 of creation, right? So it starts down here at day 6, God created Adam. Adam lived 130 years and had Seth. When Seth was 105, he had Enosh. When Enosh was 90, he had Kenan. And goes on through this lineage of the 10 patriarchs. Looking in our timeline, we know like before Christ, BC and AD, right? This would have roughly been 4,000 years BC. So back here at 0, we're really 4,000 years BC, and this would be 39, 38, 37, and so on. But since God wrote it this way, I'll kind of explain it to you, going from Adam as being 0 year going forward. So it's going to be a calendar, but it's a little different than what we'd think. And the young people at 10th Hour Project have corrected me that it was not BC, but ACE, or BCE, before Common Era and after Common Era. I'm like, no, it's before Christ. Okay, so this is that timeline. Now, in the Bible, remember I showed you how significant the Hebrew characters were? Also, names are very significant in the Bible. Adam, his name meant man. Seth, as an example, was an appointed replacement. He was a replacement for Abel, who was killed. And if let's go to page 3. Right here we see, as this continues, we see Jared, and Jared's name was shall come down. This was probably at the time that the Genesis chapter 6 happened, when the angels came down. Enoch, remember Enoch was the one who walked with God. At 365 years he was taken. In that lineage, in Genesis chapter 5, the only thing that's said about Enoch is Enoch, that Enoch walked with God. He was so close to God that at 365 years ago, it said he was taken. God took him. He was not. So he was actually taken. He did not die. Who else didn't die? Elijah. Yeah, he was taken up in chariot. So we have 2 that didn't die. In Revelations, it talks about 2 witnesses that come back. And I often wonder if it's them, if it's those 2, because it says it is appointed once for man to die. But these are the only 2 that haven't died yet. It's just a thought. I don't know if it's... But Enoch was one, and Enoch meant teaching. Enoch, when he had his son Methuselah means his death shall bring. So Methuselah, it was kind of prophesied that he would die at the time that the flood happened. So he actually died right before the flood. Lamech, what do you think the meaning of Lamech would be? Without looking at the notes. It's to lament or to sorrow. So his name meant like to sorrow. And then Noah's name was Comforter. Now, if we look at the names of these first 10, these are the first 10 patriarchs of our Bible. If we look at their names, we have like Adam was man, appointed, Lamech was the despairing, and Noah's comfort. If we look at these and we read them, let's read those together from top to bottom, just their name. Man, appointed, mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down teaching. His death shall bring the despairing comfort. Anybody get shivers? The names of the first 10 patriarchs also give the whole story of Christ, right? Man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down teaching, his death shall bring the despairing comfort. That must have been a coincidence, right? Everybody's shaking their head no. That's good. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of Genesis chapter 5, just kind of another, something else in the Old Testament pointing forward to Christ. We saw the first word, the Son of God destroyed by his own hand on a cross. The first word of the Bible talks about the coming Messiah. The second word talks about how he was the one that created all things. The third word gives us the whole Psalms 23. This gives us the lineage. The lineage gives us the story again. The story is told to us over and over again if we look through it. A piece of paper is 3/1000 of an inch thick. If all we're looking at is the surface, we don't get a lot of depth to that, right? But if we look at this and study it with the leading of the Holy Spirit, it's real deep. You know, our Bible is really deep. Okay, page 4 of this handout. On page 4 right here, we see this is the continuation of Noah. Now, when Noah was 500 years old is when he had his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In some of the non-canonical books, it puts their birth at within 2 to 3 years apart. So these 3 sons may have been within just a couple of years. That's not in our Bible, our canonized Bible. Some of the non-canonized books show that. But if we look at this and we start adding years together, see down here where I've added this together? This was 130 years to Shem, then 105 to the next son, and all the way through. This puts us at 1656 on God's calendar. This is 1,656 years after Adam that the flood happened. And from Genesis chapter 8, we see that the flood began on the 17th day of Iyar in 1656. And let me step forward one more page to page 5. Just to show this a little better. And then here we see in Genesis 8 that on Tishrei the 17th, the ark came to rest, and that on Iyar 27th, that Noah leaves the ark. He got on the ark on the 17th of Iyar and off the ark on the 27th of Iyar a year later. He was on the ark with the animals for 1 year and 10 days. It had been 370 days. It wasn't 40 days. That's how long it rained. But then he floated around for 6 months before it finally hit in the mountains of Ararat. And then they had to wait for the water to recede. So it was 1 year and 10 days that he was on the ark. Then the lineage continues in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, we see the line of Shem, Shem's descendants. So what the Bible shows us all the way through is the whole lineage to Jesus Christ. And it does it through this lineage of Shem. So we know that we're given in the Bible that 2 years after the flood, that Shem had his first son, Aphaxed. Okay, I give up. This guy. When he was 35, he had Shelah. When he was 30, he had Eber. When Eber was 34, he had Peleg. So this is the descendants, and this right here, this lineage of Shem goes all the way up to Nahor, who had Terah, who had Abraham. So it gives us that lineage. A couple interesting things here. We talk about Hebrews, and what is a Hebrew? A lot of the scholars, including Flavius Josephus, go back and relate to that Hebrew means sons of or descendants of Eber. So Hebrew probably came from the descendants of this man right here, Eber. So when you hear the name of a Hebrew, it's someone who descended from this line, possibly from Eber. So everyone in this line would have been considered a Hebrew. Now that is different than being an Israelite, which is different than being a descendant of Abraham and different from being a Jew, right? And so we'll go through and talk about who these particular people were. Because anymore, it's kind of like the names are all thrown around and mixed together. And we'll show here what the differences in this class are between a Hebrew, an Israelite, a Jew, a descendant of Abraham. Okay, so that was Eber. We read in the Genesis 11 about Peleg, that Peleg was on the land he lived when the land was divided, right? When was the land divided? It's probably referring to Babel, Tower of Babel. Remember, God came down and confused their language and then separated them and drove them different directions. Let's kind of look at that. What we have here is Shem's descendants. But there's Ham and Japheth, right? So we have these two lineages. And down here at the bottom, I've put those together here. right over here you have Japheth. And Japheth's descendants are Gomer, Magog, Madal, Javal, Tubal, Mashiach, and Taras. And then over here we have Ham. And his was Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And from Canaan we have these guys over here. And we're going to talk quite a bit about them. But we have, remember the time of Nimrod? Nimrod would have been a descendant over here, I believe, I may be wrong, I have to go check my notes, of Tubal. Nimrod would have lived like second or third generation after the flood, right about this time in here. So he probably lived right between 1700 and 1800. He was the one who started the Tower of Babel. That was when God saw that they had not spread to fill the earth and came down and confused their language and separated them. So that would have been an understanding of why Peleg lived when the world was divided. There are teachings, like in Josephus and other places, that Eber, remember he was one that were the sons of Eber. There are non-biblical teachings, and you never want to let the truth interfere with a good story, right? So there are teachings that Eber did not participate in the Tower of Babel. So when God came down and separated them and confused their language into the 70 different languages, that his was not confused, and that was the original Hebrew language. So there's non-biblical text and a lot of study that says that that was how Hebrew survived, that Hebrew would have been the language that came out of the Garden of Eden. And so, the Hebrew disappeared after 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and just came back into play in 1948, right? So Hebrew is the language that came back. Okay. These descendants, we have Eber, Peleg, Ru, Sherug, Nahor, Terah, and then he became the father of Abraham. So when he was 70 years old, Abraham was born, or Abram. What is Abraham known for? Who was he? He is like the father or the forefather of the nation of Israel, right? The nation of Israel was completely destroyed and scattered in 70 AD. When did the nation of Israel come back as a nation? That was the 6-Day War. But they were reestablished 1948. In 1948 in England, the Balfour Declaration reestablished the nation of Israel. So the nation of Israel, who Abraham was the father of the nation of Israel, was reestablished in 1948. Look on this timeline when Abraham was born. On God's timeline, following this from Adam forward, Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel, was born 1948 years after creation of man. His nation was reborn in our timeline in 1948. That's a pretty amazing coincidence, isn't it? So he was reborn in 1948, or he was born in 1948. His nation was reborn in our timeline in 1948. So that must be just coincidence. That was roughly about 2000 or 2050 BC. Okay, Abraham, remember he was called, God called him, he was living in the land of Ur, and God called him to go to a land that he had created for him, a promised land. He was 75 years old, and God called him to go to the promised land that he had created for him. That was the year 2023. You don't suppose that would mean anything, do you? So he was called, Abraham and Lot traveled to Canaan. Let me go forward one more page to page 6. Okay, so Abraham called by God to leave his home and family and go to a land that God would show him, the promised land, in 2023 in his timeline at 75 years old. I'm not saying anything, that's just kind of neat. Okay, Abram at 86 had Ishmael. he had been promised by God that his descendants would be like the sands on the shore, right? Or the stars in the sky. So we know the story that he decides that his wife Sarah had not gotten pregnant, that she was barren, and so he takes his handmaiden Hagar and has Ishmael. But then later, at 100 years old, he does have his son Isaac. So at 86 he has Ishmael, and then at 100 he has Isaac. What did Sarah do when the angel told him that he was going to have a child, him being 100 years old and her being 90? She laughed, right? And the angel said, "You laughed." She said, "No, I didn't." I said, "Yeah, you did." I said, "No, I didn't." I said, "Yes, you did." So she laughed. What does the name Isaac mean? Laughter. So Isaac means laughter. So Isaac was born, and then at 60 years old, he had his two sons, Jacob and Esau. Then Jacob and Esau, when Jacob leaves for Haran, he was 77 years old. On the timeline, remember he went and he fell in love with Rachel, and Rachel's father said, "If you work for 7 years, I will give her to you." And so he worked for the 7 years, and his father-in-law tricked her and gave him Leah instead. And he said, "You've tricked me." And he said, "If you will complete the 7 days of consummating your marriage, then I will give you Rachel also." So he does that. So 7 days later, he also gets Rachel. But then he has to work for another 7 years. So in the birth of all of these children, we had 11 children born. It was over a 7-year time period. 7 years later, he left with both of his wives and 11 sons. And remember, Benjamin was born later, but he left with the 7. So when you think about these 11 sons or 12 sons, they're not that far apart in age. A lot of times you think there's a big age difference, but they're fairly close. I don't know if I could handle 7 or 11 kids in 7 years. I haven't been able to handle one, so that's why I have dogs. But anyway, they're all born in this 11-year time period. Now, we see here that Joseph, his son, lives 110 years. And we know from this we have the start of the 7 good years when Joseph was 30 years old, and then 7 years of drought at their time in Egypt. And we'll go through this a lot more in depth. But what I've shown you right here on this part is the sons that were born to Israel. Remember, Jacob is the one who became Israel, of the nation of Israel. So over here, back there we had Eber, which was his descendants were the Hebrews. Here we have Jacob, who became Israel. And so an Israelite is any of his descendants, right? So all 12 tribes are all Israelites. Who are the Jews? The Jews are the descendants of the southern tribe, which would have been Judah and Benjamin. So Jews are typically just Judah and Benjamin. An Israelite could mean any of the 12. Typically it refers to the 10 northern tribes. And they were everyone but Judah and Benjamin. So this is kind of where those names come from. We talk about a Jew or an Israelite or a Hebrew. It's where you go into this lineage. If you notice, like Ishmael was Hebrew. He was a son of Abraham. He wasn't an Israelite, though, right? So if that kind of clears up some of the confusion of what these names mean. Okay. Right here we have Israel's wives and sons, or descendants. Remember, he had Leah and her handmaiden, Rachel and her handmaiden. The firstborn was Reuben, then Simeon, then Levi, Judah, Issachar. Well, actually, it was 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you had Dan and Naphtali, then Gad and Asher, 7 and 8. Issachar 9, Zerubbabel 10, and then Joseph and Benjamin were 11 and 12. Remember, Joseph was the one who got the fancy coat? He got the coat signifying him as being the firstborn son. Even though he was actually the 11th son, he was given that prominence in the family. But he was the firstborn son of Rachel. And Rachel was the one that Israel loved, right? He was one she fell in love with. So you can kind of understand why he would give that child that prestige or that position in the family. So this just kind of shows who they were. And I put an N and an S, whether they were northern tribes or southern tribe. And we'll get into that a lot as we go through this class. But this kind of is just to show what the different, like the lineage from from Adam, all the way up through the flood, through the descendants of Shem, through Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11. So this takes us up through all of those. Now let me back up right here to this, Ham. What do we know about Ham? Other than we always eat it on Easter afternoon. Ham was the one, remember Noah, after the flood, he planted a vineyard. He had a little bit too much wine and got drunk. And it says that Ham went in and saw his nakedness. Nakedness could mean a lot of things. If you go back to Leviticus, and it talks about who you can have relationships with, and it says, do not have relationships with your husband's, with your father's wife. That exposes his nakedness. It could have been that he was referring to the nakedness of Noah's wife. But anyway, whatever happened in that tent, when Noah came out and found out what happened, he didn't curse Ham. Who did he curse? He cursed Canaan. He said, cursed will be your son Canaan. That's this guy right here. Canaan was Ham's son, and Noah pronounced some sort of curse on him. Canaan was the father of the Sidonians, Hittites, Jebusites, Arites, Girgashites, Hivitites, Arkites, Sionites, all these guys. Coors Lights, Bud Lights, whatever. So he was the father of all of these tribes, or all these people. When the Israelites entered into the promised land, who was it they had to fight and drive out? It was all of these guys. So these are the ones that went into what was called the land of Canaan. It was actually the land of Israel. But it was this land called the land of Canaan, and it was all the descendants of Canaan who was cursed by Ham. And they were the ones that inhabited it. And we also know that some of these were giants, right? So something had happened, and we'll talk about Genesis 6 later, that maybe came through the cursing of Canaan or through whatever he was. Obviously, Noah knew something about Canaan, about what was going to happen. And so he said, cursed will be your son Canaan. But these are the people that the Israelites had to fight against and drive out of the promised land. These are all the descendants of Canaan. Any questions on that? Does that kind of help make sense of this history? So this just it shows some amazing things. It shows in several places that it actually points forward to that Jesus is the Messiah, right? This right here, the names in these lineages. Man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down teaching, his death shall bring despairing comfort. That's all about the Son of God. We see it in many different places through here. In 1948, that Abram was born in 1948, the nation of Israel was reborn in our timeline in 1948. Why don't we stop here and take about a 10-minute break, and then I'll continue on if there are any questions. So this kind of gave us the lineage of all the people of the Bible. Remember, the first 11 chapters are ancient history. And it was the history from Adam up to the birth of Abraham. One of the toughest parts about teaching Old Testament survey is chapter 6. What are you guys' thoughts on chapter 6? Or do you have thoughts on chapter 6? In chapter 6, and let me read this out of NIV. When men began to increase in numbers on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married them, any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become, and that every inclination of his thoughts of his heart were only evil at the time. The Lord was grieved that he made him on earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals, creatures that move along the ground. Next page. Birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then it goes on with the account of Noah. The sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. There's two kind of schools on thought of this. One that's been taught a lot in a lot of seminaries is that the sons of God were the descendants of Seth. And it says that they were giants. And people say, well, someone 6 foot tall, like to Dwayne and myself, that would be a giant. To anybody else, it may not be. If you look at this, the other thoughts on this, that the sons of God were actually the fallen angels. That the fallen angels had come to earth and somehow had intermingled with the daughters and had offspring by them, and that was giants. We see a lot of cases in the Bible about these giants. What are some examples? Goliath. David picked up 5 stones. We see that Goliath had 4 brothers. We see King Og. His bed was like 7 foot wide by 15 foot long. We see a lot of mention of the giants when when the 12 spies went into the promised land and looked at it. They came back with a report that these men are like giants. We look like grasshoppers in their sight. So we see over and over again about these giants. And whatever happened, it seems like somehow this situation in Genesis chapter 6, possibly somehow it polluted the line, maybe the DNA somehow of the people. Animals, birds, everything. And that was why the earth was destroyed. We also see that Noah was found righteous in God's eyes. Another word for that is he was found to be pure in his eyes, almost like a pure human. So it could almost be that this would have been some sort of impurity. Remember, we have to go back to the Garden of Eden. That Satan, God said, her seed is going to destroy you. Satan knows that. So Satan would have been doing anything he possibly could to destroy this line of the descendants of Abraham, right? And to line up to that, to destroy this pure line. So possibly what happened here is that it was maybe some sort of contamination of some sort. The argument people have about the Old Testament, and I'm sure you've heard this, is people will say, well, the God of the Old Testament was so mean. He destroyed entire races of people, men, women, and children. And yes, they were sinful, we see that, but maybe it was something more. Maybe there was something wrong with the whole lineage. That it was no longer descendants of Adam and Eve, but something else. So whatever you think in Genesis chapter 6 is kind of a pivotal point. We see in it that the Nephilim were the earth in those days and also afterwards. These Nephilim were the descendants of this relationship, and they were the ones who were giant. We saw them as the family of Canaan, right? Those were the Hittites were the ones who were the giants at the base of the base of Mount Hermon, and that was who Caleb wanted to go after. Remember, Caleb wanted to go in and fight them all. I'm sure he won. That was the ones that they were supposed to drive out. Remember, Saul was told to totally destroy them, but he didn't, and it caused him so much trouble. Perhaps there was something that went on here that caused that. That would make, if you can wrap your arms around that there was something like that, then everything that happens in the Old Testament will make sense. the fact that God called them to go in and totally wipe out. In some case, it was just the men. In some case, it was everything, even in animals, right? So something happened in Genesis 6 here that caused that. What it was exactly, we don't know. And you can research, you find a lot of information both ways. If you've ever done a research for giants or giant skeletons, like just on Google, it is incredible. In the 1800s, in Ohio, in the Ohio Valley, on the West Coast, in the gold rush years, I mean, they were finding skeletons of 8, 10, 12 foot, 15 foot high giants all the time. You can see news reports after news report, like from Los Angeles and San Francisco Times from the 1800s, with pictures of these giants and people standing next to them with their shovel. So it's something had happened, and there's a lot of proof for it, but it's hard to know exactly what it was. So anyway, this in Genesis 6 is kind of a pivotal point that starts the whole flood, puts that into motion that God's going to bring a flood to destroy all this. But we also see that it says that they were on the earth at that time and after. So somehow after the flood, it started again. They typically had what characteristics? You might remember reading this. 6 fingers, 6 toes, 2 rows of teeth. And that's in our Bible, that these descendants had 6 fingers and 6 toes and 2 rows of teeth. A lot of these skeletons they found, 6 fingers, 6 toes, 2 rows of teeth. So it's kind of a genetic deformality. Is that a word, deformality? Okay. Sometimes I make up my own words. But anyway, this is kind of what went on in chapter 6, and that is what brought on this curse and the flood. So whatever it was had polluted mankind, whether it was just their own sin, their own rebellion against God, whatever, this brought on the flood. This was before Moses, right? This was back before Israel, before all that. So we're thinking about a time when there's not a lot of information given about them knowing God. You know, unless they could see and understand that there had to be a God through creation. You know, there really wasn't any written word or written record. They didn't have the Old Testament. They didn't have scrolls. They didn't have any written record about who God was. God really hadn't revealed himself in a written form at this time. So, is it starting? Did I do something? Is that a sign from God? I hope I'm telling God. So this is what happened, and this is what I think led up to a lot of who were the Canaanites, who they had to go in and drive out of the promised land. In your book on page 67 is chart number 6, and these are kind of the dates. Remember, chapters 1 through 11 are about this old history, ancient history, and it leads us up to a time of Abraham. So here we see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So this is kind of what we've just seen in the handout I gave you. Here we have Abraham born at 2165 BC. So this is from our calendar going the other way, right? From Christ going back. What I showed you, 1948, was from Adam and Eve going forward to 1948. So that puts Abraham's birth, and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. So this kind of shows some things. Abraham reaches Canaan at this time. The Sodom and Gomorrah story was right before the birth of Isaac. Death of Sarah. Birth of the twins, Esau and Jacob, about this time. Joseph flees. Joseph sold into Egypt. So it kind of shows a timeline of what is going on getting into Egypt. The way the book ends in chapter 50 is the descendants of Israel, his 12 sons and their wives, have gone into Egypt to get away from the drought. And they've been given land there. And later, at 110 years old, Joseph dies. And that is the end of Genesis. So Genesis takes us up to that point. In chart 7, what we see here in Genesis, and this is on page 68 of your book, is that just in chapters 1 through 11, the book Genesis is event dominant, or predominant. So it's all about events. Then from chapter 12 to chapter 50, it's about people and persons. At the beginning, it's the creation, the fall of man, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And then in 12 through 50, it's about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. In chapter 1 through 11, it's about the race as a whole, and then about the family of Abraham. And the rest of the Bible is predominantly about the family of Abraham. The rest of the Old Testament. Okay, what I'd like to do now is just go through kind of the prominent subjects. In Genesis, this chart right here is chart 11 in your book, but it kind of just shows an outline. We'll see this for each one of the books. There's one of these. And it shows like chapters 1 through 6 is creation, fall, flood, the birth of the nations, then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. This is how it's broken down by chapters. And so this just kind of is an outline of the book. The first part, creation of heaven and earth, that's chapters 1 and 2. And in this we have the book of Genesis begins with a description of creation. It progresses from light, firmament, divisions of water, dry land vegetation, light bearers, birds and fish, and lastly animals, culminating in the day of rest. So we see this, the 6 days of creation, the day of rest in the first chapter. Chapter 1 up to verse 5 deals with the universe, and 6 to 31 deal with the earth. So it starts out the universe and then the earth. Then up to chapter 2, verse 25, deals with the creation of man. In chapters, so that is right here in the creation. Chapters 2 and 4 through 15, the Bible describes the creation of man as God formed him from the dust of the ground, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The Garden of Eden is described as having been planted by God with a river in it and divides into 4 rivers. But it says here, God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Do you suppose that maybe those from Genesis 6 maybe didn't have God's breath of life? That maybe that was a spirit? Perhaps maybe that was what caused all this between those descendants and God's descendants? I'm just speculating. In chapters 3 through 4 is the fall of man deceived by a serpent. In 2 Corinthians we see, but I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. In Revelations 12:9, so the great dragon who was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceived the whole earth, he was cast to earth and his angels were cast out with him. In Revelations 22, he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil, and bound him for 1,000 years. So we see this dragon or serpent and Satan all referred to as the same being. The serpent deceived Eve. Eve then gave whatever it was to Adam, and he took and ate it also. Is there a story of Christ in that? Was Adam deceived? It doesn't say one way or the other. It doesn't say that Adam was also deceived. Adam's bride had taken whatever this was, she had been deceived. He knew now that she was mortal and she would have to die for this sin. Adam also took it and ate of it, knowing that he would also have to die with her. Is this a picture of us and Jesus? Adam probably didn't have to do that, but he chose to be with his wife, to die with her, that maybe he chose to eat so that he would be like her, so that he took on the human form, the mortal form, to die. Have you ever thought of that? So maybe perhaps this in some way is a picture of Jesus' love for us, to come and die for us, in the same way that Adam chose to die with his wife, to be with her. So it's in a sad way, it's a really beautiful picture. So this took place in the Garden of Eden. This is where we had the dialogue between God and Adam and Eve about what went on. After this happened, they ended up realizing they were naked, their sinfulness, and they clothed themselves with some sort of plant, fig leaves or whatever. God saw them, and God made clothes for them, right? And I hope it was snakeskin. I mean, that would be just speculating. That'd be kind of cool. It's where like rattlesnake skin boots came from, right? Okay, so then in Genesis 6, we see the flood account. So this is chapters 6 through 9. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's pretty sad. Noah and his wife and 3 sons and their wives were saved because Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So in that, oh, that was it. I'd be clipped for my glasses. In that, of all the millions of people on the earth at that time, only 8 were saved. Does anybody know what the ancient flag of China was before the Ming Dynasty and before all that? It was a ship with 8 people on it. So the story is just everywhere. So he found favor in his wife. So that is chapter 6 through 9 gives us the story of the flood right in here. So remember, all this is event prominent. Then in chapter 10 and 11, we see the birth of nations. So after the flood, then Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives had to repopulate the earth. This was around the area of Shinar, where they started. So these 2 chapters form a link between Noah and Abraham through the line of Shem, Noah's second son. The chronological order of events was a flood, a new start of the human race and family of Noah, migration to Shinar, the building projects of Babel, confusion of the language, and geographical scattering. Let me wake up Google Earth. Maybe I passed it. Oops. We have, this right here is a map of the Mediterranean Sea. Here's the boot. What is that? Italy, right? Spain over here. What we have here is all of these names. These were the descendants. If you look at this right here, the descendants of Japheth are just a name. The descendants of Ham have a box around them, and the descendants of Shem have a line underneath them. And then if it's Shem and Ham together, it has like the squiggly line under it. So from this, we can see where the different descendants went. If you notice all of these up here, Tubal, Gomer, all of these, they're just names without anything. So that's Japheth. So Japheth's descendants went to the north. The descendants of Ham primarily went towards Africa. So they were the ones that had the box all the way around them. So this right here is the Nile Delta in Egypt. So they went this direction. And then the last one is Shem. And these are the ones that just have the lines by them. You see them here. Notice, though, that one of the ones of descendant of Ham is Canaan. And see where he is right here? This is what's modern-day Israel. This would be on the west side of the Jordan River, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, was where these descendants of Canaan ended up. And that was all the ites. Okay. Now, if Google Earth is awake, yes. I love Google Earth. Where did the ark come to rest? On Mount Ararat? Or in the mountains of Ararat, right? This is Mount Ararat. Ararat or Arat? So it doesn't really matter, right? Okay. So this right here was the mountain, or Mount Ararat. And this would have been the area, or these mountains, that the ark came to rest. There's an interesting anomaly right over here. Let me look straight down at it. You see this right here? This is 150 foot wide and 450 foot long. It's the dimensions of the ark. It's about 30 miles from Mount Ararat itself, or the mountain of Ararat. And you can kind of see it right here, the depression of it. What's interesting about this is there's been a lot of study here, and at one time, yeah, there it is. No, I don't want. Okay. Anyway, in this area, what they did is they've gone in and done sounding and radiography into the ground, and there's anomalies like every 10 feet all the way across it, like timbers, and then also the other direction. And they found evidence in a special laid out pattern of like pieces of metal or iron. So it's almost like that may have been it. In fact, over here is let's look at the map. Let's see if I can get a picture of it. Okay, let me see if I can land over here. Oh, it doesn't show it. But anyway, this is actually the visitor center for Noah's Ark. Did anybody even know that was there? Yeah, this is another picture. So it's almost like things are being revealed to us that we didn't know, 50 years or 100 years ago. But this indention right here is the exact dimensions of the ark. The ark is 150 feet by 450 feet by 75 foot deep. I took some classes in naval engineering, and the ratios of the most stable barge on ocean are the ratios of the ark. In fact, there are several U.S. Navy ships built to these exact ratios. So these ratios have been proven to be the most stable ratio for a barge, not necessarily for a ship, but for a barge. It wasn't really a ship, but it was a barge to carry animals. But in waves and winds, it's about the most stable ratios. So we have this talking about in Genesis 6. We're given all this. Once we get to chapter 12, we get into Abraham. So now here from 12 on, we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Abraham, beginning here, the focus turns towards the human race as a whole, beginning with the family of Abraham, the nation of Israel. Note that the world of chapter 11 was in spiritual darkness without hope. God calls to Abraham to begin a new chapter in world history. Remember, there was no Bible, there were no scrolls, there really was no written word about God or who God was up until this point. Abraham's call, his first call was in Genesis 12:1, and he was in Haran. For his first, if I would have gone one click the other way, I would have been there. Okay, so this is, Abraham had grown up in Ur of the Chaldees. And then he and his father and brother and Lot traveled to Haran. And they were in this town right here when he got the first call from God. And so now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in all your families of the earth shall be blessed." So he leaves, and God is leading him to here. Now this area right here, this is the Jordan River. This is the Dead Sea. This is Sea of Galilee. This area right here is what's modern-day Israel. is that time was the land of Canaan. This is all descendants of Canaan. So Abraham comes here, and this place right here, Shechem, he gets a second call. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then his third call was in Bethel. So the third time God shows up to talk to him, he says, and the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also would be that number. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Does this land belong to the Palestinians? No. Can it be split between the descendants of Abraham and the Palestinians? No. So this land was given 3,500 years ago by God to the descendants of Abraham. Pretty highly contested land now, isn't it? I don't think God's going to let them lose it. I mean, my bet would be on God's side. Abraham's fourth call was in Hebron, which is right here. So during his life, remember he's called at 75 years old. At 86, he has Ishmael. At 100, he has Isaac. So anyway, in chapter 15, he says, was his fourth call. He said, he brought him outside and said, look now towards heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. He says, so shall be your descendants. In Genesis 15:18, on the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, and Perizzites, the Rephaim. Perizzites, did I say that right? The Rephaim, which were giants, the Amorites, which were giants, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. That is really hard for an engineer to say. Anyway, so he's given them all those. In Genesis 17, 1-8, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you and multiply you exceedingly. Abraham fell on his face, and God talked to him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name is Abraham, for I have made you father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in this generation, for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, and as everlasting possession, and I will be their God. 99 years old, he gets this. He's been given it 4 times, this promise. He has Isaac, the child of promise. So Isaac is the next one. Remember, Abraham thinks he's supposed to have a lot of children. He's been given this promise. Sarah, his wife, is barren. He takes her handmaiden, Hagar, and has a son with him, right? Ishmael. Ishmael was 14 when Isaac was born. Ishmael had the same father, right? He had the same father, Abraham. Ishmael is the father of who? What's that? Some, but oh gosh, I just lost the name. The religion, Islam. He's the father of Islam. Islam believes that it wasn't Isaac who was going to be sacrificed, but it was Ishmael. They believed Abraham was going to sacrifice Ishmael, not Isaac. So their belief is that it was him instead of Isaac. So that, when you're talking to one, you've always got that common era. Yeah, we're all descendants from Abraham, but it was Isaac that the promise came through. So from chapter 25 and chapter 26 talks about Isaac. Of the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Isaac was the least conspicuous, traveled the least, had the fewest extraordinary adventures, and he lived the longest. In chapter 26, God reaffirms his promise to Isaac's father, father Abraham. So Isaac is given the same promise. Pointing forward to Jesus, we have an interesting story in Isaac. Abraham was told to give Isaac as a sacrifice, right? Abraham travels with Isaac to where? Same place the Temple Mount is. He takes Isaac. Isaac carried the wood. We're always portrayed thinking Isaac is this young little boy. Isaac hauled all the wood up there for sacrifice. He was probably a young, healthy man. My guess is he was probably about 33. Isaac is going to be sacrificed. He's probably a young man. His dad is well over 100 now. Isaac could probably have easily overpowered him. My guess is Isaac probably was going to give his life willingly. We know the story. When Abraham got ready to kill Isaac, he was stopped, right? The Holy Spirit stopped him. There's a ram stuck in a tree behind him. They sacrificed that instead. In the story, we see this whole narrative of him traveling, of him going up on the hill, of him preparing the altar, of Abraham binding Isaac, getting ready to kill him. We see that whole narrative. Then we see Abraham coming down. We don't see any mention of Isaac. It's 2 or 3 chapters later that Abraham sends his unnamed messenger go back to my people and find a wife for my son Isaac. Is this sounding familiar? Jesus died on that. Jesus went to heaven. Jesus did not return, but his Father sent the Holy Spirit to find and prepare a wife for him. Isaac is hanging out at home, this unnamed servant, and typically when you see an unnamed servant, it's a picture of the Holy Spirit. This unnamed servant goes back to his people, finds a wife, Rebekah, for Isaac, brings her to him. Isaac leaves home, and they meet together somewhere in between. Does that sound a lot like Jesus, the Holy Spirit preparing a bride for Christ? A rapture-type scenario where they meet somewhere between? It's like a perfect picture of the end times, isn't it? Have you guys seen that? It's a neat story how that all transferred. But when you read about it, you don't read anything about Isaac coming down after the whole sacrifice scenario. But you see him 2 or 3 chapters later, I think in maybe 26, where his dad is sending an unnamed servant to go find a bride for him. So this is another picture of the coming Messiah. Okay, so being pretty boring and fewest adventures, he lives the longest. Wish I had a boring background. So God reaffirms his promise to Isaac's father Abraham. Then we have Jacob. Jacob is the descendant of Isaac and Rebekah, right? So Jacob shows how God can lay hold of a selfish, willful, deceitful man and transform his life in the end to one in which is noble and beautiful in character. Jacob is the focus of 10 chapters in Genesis, from 27 to 37. Chart 8 shows a general breakdown of these chapters. Okay, do I have chart 8 here? I don't, so we'll skip that. Let me show you this. Well, let me finish this, my notes here. Okay, so Jacob had 4 wives. Leah, Zilpah, Bilhah, and Rachel bore him 12 sons, most of which became the 12 tribes of Israel. In chapter 32, verse 28, we see Jacob's name being changed to Israel. So Jacob's name became Israel. That's where we get the nation of Israel. It's just this guy, Jacob. Okay. In this chart here, this family tree is up good. Chart 9 on page, 77 of your book? Okay. Here we see Terah. Remember from the timeline I gave you guys? We saw Terah being born. He had 3 sons, Haran, Nahor, and Abram. So he had 3 sons. Abram, his handmaid Hagar had Ishmael. His wife Sarah, remember it started as Sarai, and then it was changed to Sarah. She had the son Isaac. Abraham sent his unnamed servant back to his family to find a bride for Isaac, right? If we look over here, Nahor, we see Laban and Rebekah. This is where Rebekah came from. So Abraham sent his unnamed servant to the family of Nahor. He finds Rebekah, brings Rebekah back, and she becomes the wife of Isaac. Nahor had Rebekah and Leah. This is Laban. So Rebekah, Isaac's wife, her brother is Laban. Laban is the one that had the 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, and that is where Jacob got his wife. Remember, Jacob flees because he's afraid Esau is going to kill him. He goes running off to his cousins, finds Laban, falls in love with Rachel, and that was that whole story that he got tricked, ended up with Leah, then 7 days later got Rachel, so he had the 2 wives now, works another 7 years and then leaves, and he leaves with all of these kids: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zerubbabel, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. Benjamin was actually born later. He was born on the road. But these 11 ones were the ones that Jacob left with when he left Laban's land. Who was the firstborn? Reuben. Reuben should have gotten the firstborn blessing. But what happened, if you follow this dotted line here, this is the line to Christ. We had Abraham and Isaac with Rebekah. The dotted line goes to Jacob. Over here it goes to Leah. Leah goes to Judah, and Judah was the great-great-grandfather of King David. So this is our lineage to our Messiah. Joseph was the one who got the blessing of being like the head of the house, or got the firstborn blessing. He was the firstborn of Rachel, the one that Jacob was in love with. So he got the blessing. He had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. What we see later, right now we have these 6, these 2, and these 2 as being the 12 tribes. Later on, we're going to see that Joseph is not listed as one of the 12 tribes when they get into the land of Canaan, but Ephraim and Manasseh have taken Joseph's place. That would make 13, right? The tribe of Levi becomes priests, and so they don't get land of their own, but they are divided into small groups, and each one of the tribes gets a certain amount of the Levites as priests for them. So right now you're seeing the 12 sons of Jacob, but the 12 tribes do not include Levi or Joseph, but include Ephraim and Manasseh. Why did Levi end up getting the blessing of being the priests? It happened at Mount Sinai. Moses was of the tribe of Levi. Moses had gone up on Mount Sinai for the 40 days. He got the 10 commandments. He comes back down. They've made a golden calf, and they're worshiping it, right? And when he comes down and destroys it, Moses said, "Who will stand with me on God's side?" All the Levites go over and say, "We will." All of his kin. Because of that, they got the blessing of being the priests. That was why the Levites ended up being all your priests and the ones who controlled the tabernacle and all the parts of the tabernacle. So they were the ones who ended up with that. Kind of in ending on this, let me talk about 2 things. We have a couple guys here. Ishmael. We have this guy, the son of Hagar. He is thought, he would have been the firstborn son of Abraham, but not the one of promise from Sarah. Abraham decided that he would, and Sarah decided they would take matters in their own hands, since obviously God didn't know how to get Sarah, which she would bear a child, so they chose Hagar and had Ishmael. The other one here is Esau. Esau was the firstborn of Rebekah. He came out first. Jacob was hanging on to his heel. Jacob means heel grabber. Esau, what does Esau mean? Just means red. Somehow he was red in appearance. If we look at these two guys, Esau and Ishmael, and this is just talking about their background. Ishmael's descendants became the nation of Islam. So the nation of Islam goes back to Ishmael, the son of Abram. In Genesis 16:12, it says, "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." Does that sound like the description that fits? Like bingo, right? Yeah, that's a perfect description. Genesis 25:13 lists him as having 12 sons. The second son, Kedar, is thought to be in the line of Muhammad. So Muhammad would have been a descendant from Ishmael. Esau, the red, the son of Isaac, the fraternal twin of Jacob. Is that right? Not identical, fraternal twin of Jacob. Esau is known as Edom, the progenitor of the Edomites, who were established to the south of the Israelites. They were the enemy nation of Israel. Remember when Israel came out of Egypt and they were traveling and they wanted to go into this land and they had to pass through the land of the Edomites, and they asked for permission, said, we will stay right on the king's highway, we won't get off. If we drink any water or eat any food, we'll pay for it. And they refused them. These were the Edomites. This is Jacob's brother. So this is their fathers, and father of Israel. This is like their uncle. This is old Uncle Esau, won't let them pass through. So they were the enemies of the nation of Israel. In Genesis 26:34, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Berai the Hittite, and also Basmath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were source aggrieved to Isaac and Rebekah. So Esau marries two Hittites. Remember who the ites were? These are descendants of Canaan. These are the guys that inhabited the promised land before they got there. These are the ones that Noah said, your descendants from Canaan will be cursed. So he marries two of these ladies. So that's why Rebekah and Esau were definitely upset about it. So he marries, they were commanded not to marry out of their, out of the Israelites, out of their family. But here they had. In Genesis 28:29, so he went to Ishmael. So now he's got two wives of Hittites, and now he goes back to Ishmael. Ishmael being the progenitor of the nation of Islam. So he goes to Ishmael and marries Mahalath, the sister of Nebaioth, the daughter of Ishmael, son of Abram, in addition to the wives he already had. So now he's got three wives, two are Hittites and one's Muslim. Things are just getting better and better, aren't they? So Esau was known as Edom, the progenitor of the Edomites, who were established to the south of the Israelites, and they were I said that already, didn't I? Okay, I'll say it again. They were an enemy of the nation of Israel. Okay, oh, you know what? I probably should have plugged that in. I hate it when that happens. On page 78, what we see here in this little chart is Joseph's career. So remember, Joseph was the one who had the dreams. He had the fancy coat. He was given like the position of being the first in the family. He ends up he goes to check on his brothers. He ends up being kind of attacked by his brothers. They steal his coat. They put him in a well. Later, they sell him, and he ends up through a bunch of stories as going into Egypt. He becomes sitting next to Pharaoh as the second one, sitting at the right hand of Pharaoh. You guys know the whole story, right? So then he's put there, God miraculously puts him there so that when this famine comes, he will have taken care of enough food and everything to protect not only everyone in Egypt, but also his family and care for them. This is, and I wish I had my list, I think there's 40 or 50 or 60 different similarities between Joseph and Jesus. Joseph went to search for his brothers. Jesus went to search for his family. He was rejected. Jesus was rejected. He was scorned. His clothes were taken from him. Jesus, the same thing. Jesus was crucified and put in the ground for 3 days. And then he rose, right? Joseph was put into the ground. His coat was covered with blood, and it was told that he died. Do you wonder if he was in that empty well or cistern for 3 days? I wonder if he was there 3 days before they took him out. He comes out of the ground. He ends up in prison with two, was it a baker and a cupbearer? One lives, one dies. Jesus is on a cross between two sinners. One lives, one dies. Joseph ends up sitting at the right hand of Pharaoh. Jesus sits at the right hand of God. And that's just, 6 or 8 similarities? I think there's 40, if someone has seen that list. I'm sure some of you have. But it's just amazing the similarities between the two. It's like the story is an exact picture of what's going to happen to Jesus in every way. Joseph creates a way to save the people through famine, a 7-year famine, in the same way Jesus will do the same for his followers. So here we see another picture in this of the coming Messiah. And then lastly, on page 80, Genesis 11. Next time I'll remember to plug my... Well, I'm not going to say that. The Lord willing, the next time I'll remember to plug my computer in. Okay, so this is just our chart that shows the 50 different chapters. In review, we had 11 chapters of old history, then we had 39 chapters of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And the story ends with the death of Joseph. He's 110 years old. He has died in Egypt. He has his family promise to take his body out when they leave. He tells them that they will leave. He prophesies to them, you will be leaving here. Take my bodies with you. We see that he is embalmed. Not embalmed, what is like mummified? But anyway, he's prepared for death, and he is put into a coffin. One of the last things we see in Genesis is that he's put into a coffin. And then later, way later in time, it'll be next Friday, we'll see his bones being taken out and carried out of Egypt. So that's all I got for tonight. Any questions or comments or nothing? Fred, would you close us in prayer?